Welcome, everybody, to our wonderful conference that we have planned with the American Conservative today. Senator JD Vance has represented Ohio since his election in 2022. He first broke through national acclaim with his memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, in 2016, which sat on the New York Times bestseller list for 2 years. The timing was impeccable, as his story narrating the lives of real people, his families and neighbors of the American Rust Belt, dovetailed with the successful presidential run of Donald Trump, the populist uprising of the middle and working classes against elites in Washington and Wall Street and its institutions. As detailed in his book, Vance went from his own humble beginnings in Ohio into the U.S. Marine Corps, serving in the Iraq War, went on to Yale Law School before turning his attention to public office. In his time in office, he has focused his attention on the special interests that have captured the institutions and levers of power that are supposed to be working for the American people. He has also challenged the prevailing wisdom guiding foreign policy and military operations abroad. This includes his effort to condition the billions in Ukraine aid that has left U.S. coffers since 2022. At 39, he is the youngest senator serving in the U.S. Senate today and represents a cohort of young Republicans who are more likely to question their older Cold War generation cohorts on Capitol Hill. During the recent debate over Ukraine aid, he said, "This moment calls out for many things, but boomer neoconservatism is not among them," adding that the fruits of this generation in American leadership is quagmire in Afghanistan, war in Iraq under false pretenses. So we are very excited to hear more about how he and his fellow conservatives on Capitol Hill and off are focused on making sure the current U.S. foreign policy generated in Washington can benefit the middle class and all of Americans today. So without further ado, Senator JD Vance.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you. Thanks to the Quincy Institute and the American Conservative for co-hosting this thing. And I don't know, I don't remember saying that this is like boomer neoconservatism, but I certainly think that, and I'm not surprised I said it. So maybe a good way to start off the morning. But this is really important. This is a really important conversation. And I want to talk about a couple of the ways in which I apply my own foreign policy principles to the challenges that are facing the country and how I think about these things. And it's very much on the theme of how to build a foreign policy that actually works for the American middle class. And so I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be talking with all of you. And I'm going to say some things I think that a lot of you are going to agree with and some things that a lot of you are going to disagree with. And maybe, you will agree with part of what I say and disagree with part of what I say. But the most important thing I want to say about foreign policy in 2024 in the United States of America is that we really have to get past the tired old slogans and this sort of way in which you can see the foreign policy establishment seizing up when somebody makes a particular argument. The way that American foreign policy has proceeded for the last 40 years, think about the wreckage and think about the actual results. One of my favorite passages from the Bible is, "By your fruits ye shall know them." What are the fruits of the last 40 years of American foreign policy? Of course, it's the disaster in Iraq. It's the disaster in Afghanistan. It's Syria. It's Lebanon. It's on issue after issue after issue. Somehow, the foreign policy consensus of this town seems to almost always be wrong. And yet, when you challenge that consensus, the most interesting thing I've seen as a United States Senator, it's not some of the arguments that people use to push back. And very often it's repeating the same old slogans. In the Ukraine context, well, this is a war of democracy against tyranny. Well, that's like a very simplistic way, of course, to think about it. I don't think anybody, even the people who say these things, actually believe them. Of course, Ukraine is hardly a perfect democracy. That doesn't mean, by the way, that we shouldn't support the Ukrainians, though I obviously think that we've done more than our fair share. It just means that you can't repeat the same old slogans again and again and again. But it's not even that. It's not the way that people repeat the slogans, which I find so interesting. It's this weird way in which they seize up when the foreign policy conventional wisdom is challenged in this town. And people are terrified of confronting new arguments, I believe, because they're terrified of confronting their own failure over the last 40 years. I was elected United States Senator in 2022. I was born in August of 1984. I'm coming up on my 40th birthday, so I appreciate your condolences. Senator Mitch McConnell was elected literally the year that I was born. And Mitch McConnell is extremely confident about nearly every single foreign policy view that he holds, despite the fact that he's been a senator since I was born, and nearly every foreign policy position he's held has actually been wrong. Okay. So whatever your views, if I can impart something really, really important to you or to anybody else who's listening on social media or otherwise, it's that we have to be open to new arguments. When people say something that challenges our preconceived notions, if your response is to sort of think about it, that's good. Whatever conclusion you ultimately come to. If your response is to kind of seize up and immediately repeat the slogans that we've all heard for the last 40 years, you are part of the problem. And we have to beat back the problem if we're going to fix what's going on in the country. So let me sort of articulate two, and this is not meant to be a full-scale or fulsome explanation of my foreign policy, but there are two principles that I really care about and I think are really important because they bear on this question of the middle class. The first is that the first is like a weird feedback there, but the first is that we have to really understand that I think most of us are realists, right? In other words, we think that our foreign policy should pursue America's interests and pursue it ruthlessly. But that doesn't mean, even though we can criticize the moralisms of the past, that we can have a foreign policy that's totally divorced from morality. What I would say is we should have a foreign policy that recognizes that the moral intuitions that should most matter are the moral intuitions of American citizens, okay? That's principle number one, and I'll talk about that in a second. Principle number two is that the most important part of American, got it? Thank you. Principle number two is that the most important part of American foreign policy is actually the strength of our domestic economy and the strength of our domestic population. And if there is something that should worry all of us, I think it's not that China is showing more belligerence in East Asia, though that certainly should worry us. It's not that China is sort of expanding its scope into South America and to Africa as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, though, again, I do think that should worry us. It's that China, based and because of the stupidity of Washington leaders over the past generation, is now arguably the most powerful industrial economy in the world. Okay, if we're going to lose a war, it will be because we have allowed our primary rival to become arguably our most powerful industrial competitor. And God forbid, I worry that in 10 years, it will become obvious that China is not our primary industrial competitor, but that we're theirs, that they are now the preeminent industrial power in the world. And if we get there, yes, it will be because all of these bad things about China, and we can criticize China. But if we get there, the primary reason will be because our leaders led us down a very stupid path to very predictable consequences. I am angry about the rise of China. And certainly I don't think that the Chinese are our friends, but I am most angry that American leadership let it happen. Okay, so those are the two things I want to talk about: our domestic strength at home, and also first, I want to talk about the moral intuitions that I think that underpin American foreign policy. So let me just highlight the moral intuition argument with a couple of sort of the most pressing foreign policy controversies facing our country. Number one is, what do we do about Israel? What do we do in Israel? And question number two is, what do we do about Ukraine? And I sort of come down on very opposite sides of these particular questions. I'm supportive of Israel and their war against Hamas. I certainly admire the Ukrainians who are fighting against Russia, but I do not think that it is in America's interest to continue to fund a effectively never-ending war in Ukraine. And sort of, why are these two things different? Well, there are a few things. It's sort of weird that this town assumes that Israel and Ukraine are exactly the same. They're not, of course, and I think it's important to analyze them in separate buckets. And importantly, I think those of us who are pro-Israel have to wake up to a new reality. You see this, the consequences of it on college campuses. You see this in the way in which young people think about these different parts of the world and what America's response should be to them. And it's that even if they're pro-Israel, they're sick of the old arguments, right? The slogans don't work anymore, ladies and gentlemen. if we're going to support Israel, as I think that we should, we have to articulate a reason why it's in our best interest. If we're going to support the Ukrainians, as I think we've done, again, I think we should stop supporting the Ukrainian conflict. I think that we have to, if you want to articulate why I'm wrong, you have to start to say, this is why this is in America's best interest. So there are a few things I think that are very distinct about Israel, okay? And when I talk about the moral intuitions of the middle class, why do Americans care about Israel? Okay. I think there are all these arguments you could make, and some of them are true, and some of them are false, and some of them are fake. But look, a big part of the reason why Americans care about Israel is because we are still the largest Christian majority country in the world, which means that a majority of citizens of this country think that their savior, and I count myself a Christian, was born, died, and resurrected in that narrow little strip of territory off the Mediterranean. The idea that there is ever going to be an American foreign policy that doesn't care a lot about that slice of the world is preposterous because of who Americans are. Now, contrast that with the moral intuition that has most underlined American foreign policy of the last 20 years, this idea that it is in our distinct interest to spread democracy all over the world. Well, I actually don't think that that even holds a little bit of water. Was it in our interest to spread democracy to Iraq, where not only did a lot of Americans and a lot of other people die needlessly, but then we created a proxy of Iran in the Middle East? It's preposterous. Okay. And not only that, not only did we create a proxy of Iran in the Middle East at the cost of thousands of American lives, we also precipitated the genocide of one of the oldest Christian communities in the entire world. Now, we talk about moral intuitions, and I think our moral intuitions, we have to influence our foreign policy objectives here. If you had told the American people, if George W. Bush had stood before the American people in 2003 and said, hey guys, we're going to go to war not to eradicate weapons of mass destruction or to spread democracy, we're going to go to war to create a regional proxy for Iran and to slaughter over 1 million historical Christians. Not that they will be slaughtered at our hands, but that our actions will lead to the genocide of a historical Christian community. I don't think Americans would have supported it. And frankly, if you look at polling back in 2003, most Americans didn't care about whether Iraq was a democracy or not. The main reason that the American people supported the war in Iraq in the beginning was because they thought Saddam had weapons of mass destruction that would be used against our citizens. Okay. There was actually a very realist case made for the Iraq war. It was just wrong. And now I think hopefully all of us recognize that it was wrong. But my point is, you can't totally divorce the moral apparatus here, even in a realist foreign policy. Americans want their values reflected in the types of things that they do. And I think one of the best arguments that we should make against a lot of American involvement overseas is that it's somehow, maybe because we're careless, maybe it's purely accidental, but we keep on leading to the death of old Christian communities all over the world. I think that's a moral scandal. And I think most Americans, given that they are part of the Christian majority, would actually agree with that. Sort of weird to me that no one, even though Republicans are theoretically the Christian conservative party, that no one makes this argument that traditional neoconservative foreign policy keeps on leading to the genocide of Christians. But it does, which is why it's one of many reasons why neoconservative foreign policy is strategically and morally stupid. So that's one principle. That's one way I apply the principle that our moral intuitions should be motivated by the actual moral views of middle-class Americans is why don't we stop genociding historical Christian communities? That's like a basic thing we should do in our foreign policy. But let me just sort of dive into this a little bit, because it's not just, of course, the fact that Americans care about Israel for religious reasons. I think there actually is a hard-nosed strategic argument that we can make for why we should care about Israel too. Let me just make a couple of points on that topic. So first, Israel is one of the most dynamic, certainly on a per capita basis, one of the most dynamic and technologically advanced countries in the world. Dan Senor wrote about this in the book, The Startup Nation. And if you look at what Israel is doing just with the Iron Beam system, for example, this is a system that would allow America and our allies to actually achieve some parity with the people who are sending drones and rocket attacks and so forth. There is no way that we can long-term fight a missile defense battle against people if they're paying 1/10 or 1/100th for offensive weapons that we are paying for defensive weapons. And the Israelis are doing the most important work to actually give us missile defense parity. That's a very important national security objective of the United States of America. And that's something we're working with one of the most innovative economies in the world to accomplish. There's another reason, actually, motivated by my view that America can't do everything. And that reason is quite simple. We have to sort of ask ourselves, what do we want out of our Israeli allies? And more importantly, what do we want out of all of our allies writ large? Do we want clients who depend on us, who can't do anything without us? Or do we want real allies who can actually advance their interests on their own, with America as playing a leadership role, but our allies actually doing something too? So my biggest criticism of our approach in Ukraine is that it has no strategic end in sight, and it's not leading anywhere that's going to ultimately be good for our country. But the second biggest criticism I make about the war in Ukraine and our approach to it is that we are subsidizing the Europeans to do nothing. The Europeans are not carrying their fair share of the burden, especially when it comes in provision of weapons, and they're deindustrializing their own country at the same time that they say that Putin must be defeated at all costs. If Putin must be defeated at all costs, to our German friends, then stop deindustrializing your own country in the name of a ridiculous green energy policy. But I actually think that Washington, at least current Washington leadership, really likes the fact that the Europeans are completely dependent on us. That's not an alliance. These people aren't increasingly allies. They are client states of the United States of America who do whatever we want them to do. Well, I think we have a real opportunity to ensure that Israel is an ally in the true sense, that it's going to pursue their interests. And sometimes those interests won't totally overlap with the United States, and that's totally reasonable, but they are fundamentally self-sufficient. And I think the way that we get there in Israel is actually by combining the Abraham Accords approach with the defeat of Hamas that gets us to a place where Israel and the Sunni nations can play a regional counterweight to Iran. Again, we don't want a broader regional war. We don't want to get involved in a broader regional war. The best way to do that is to ensure that Israel, with the Sunni nations, can actually police their own region of the world. And that allows us to spend less time and less resources on the Middle East and focus more on East Asia. In the same way that we want our own allies to do the job in Europe so that we can focus on East Asia, I think that the same is true of the Sunni nations in Israel and the Middle East. We want to focus more on East Asia, so they're going to have to pick up more of the regional security apparatus. But they can't do that. The Israelis can't do that unless they defeat Hamas. There's an interesting thing, which is why we should be supporting them in the war to finish Hamas's military capabilities. And one of the things that's frankly reasonable that people say, though I think that it's wrong, is, well, you can't possibly defeat Hamas. It's an ideology. Well, you can't defeat Islamic radicalism as an ideology, and it was stupid for us to build democracies in the Middle East to try, but you can defeat ISIS as a functioning military apparatus. You can defeat Al-Qaeda as a functioning military apparatus, and there is no way for the Abraham Accords to take off, which allows us to step away from the Middle East unless Israel defeats Hamas as a functional military apparatus and builds some real alliances with the Sunni states. That, to me, is the goal of American foreign policy in the Middle East, and that's why we should be doing something much different, in my view, in Israel than we should be in Ukraine. Now, maybe you disagree with that. Happy to have that conversation, but that's fundamentally how I think about this. How do we focus on East Asia? How do we allow the moral intuitions of America's middle class to influence our own foreign policy instead of crazy things like spread democracy to every corner of the world? These are the ways that I think about that particular conflict and some of the principles that I have and how to apply them there. Let me say the second thing here, which is you cannot have a foreign policy for the middle class unless you actually have a strong economy at home. And I don't want to, recapitulate or re-summarize all of the arguments that many of you have heard me made. But look, we allowed China to build its middle class off the backs of the American middle class. We actually promoted the creation of a Chinese super industrial economy. And the crazy thing is, when the free traders never acknowledged this point in 2024, when we were making the argument in the 70s and the 80s that we should build China's industrial economy, We were doing it explicitly with the knowledge that it would harm America's middle class. Go back and read what they were writing in the 70s and the 80s, and they said, this will harm America's middle class. This will lead to a lot of unemployed steel workers and auto workers in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, but it will be worth it because we will turn the Chinese into a flowering democracy overseas. There's that weird conceit that we have again, where again, if you ask the people in the heartland, the people that I represent, whether they care more about China becoming a democracy or whether they care more about the jobs that sustain their communities, we all know exactly what the answer is going to be, right? But now we find ourselves in a position where arguably, even today, China is the preeminent industrial power in the world. That cannot coexist with America having a foreign policy that's good for the middle class, in my view. If we are not able to be self-reliant, if we can't manufacture our own pharmaceuticals, our own munitions, the components that Americans rely on for their everyday life, then we are never going to be able to build the kind of middle class that we want in this country. Bob Lighthizer, the former trade representative of the Trump administration, and I hope a future Secretary of the Treasury or Commerce or something, Bob Lighthizer famously makes this example, which I've seen very directly in my own life in Silicon Valley. If you open up an iPhone, even today, I believe, it will say, designed in California, right? Buy a new iPhone, I believe it still says designed in California. Well, the implication, of course, is that if it was designed in California, it was manufactured somewhere else. Where was it manufactured? In Shenzhen, okay? And one of the things that we've learned over the last 20 years is that as economies become better at manufacturing things, they start to become better at designing and technology development entirely. The Western conceit that you could separate the manufacture of things from the technological innovation in those things is completely absurd and preposterous. And you see evidence of this today as the Chinese rapidly develop their own ability to manufacture chips. Why are they so good at manufacturing and designing new chip technologies? Because we allowed them to manufacture things like the iPhone for the last 20 years. And aside from the iPhone, a lot of other products even further back than 20 years ago. Right? This was insanity. It was predictable. And yet here we are and we have to deal with it. And I don't think, by the way, I think the neoconservative approach to China is sort of the dumbest of all possible solutions. They want the Chinese to manufacture all of our stuff, and they also want to go to war with China. Okay? I'm serious. If you sort of look at a 2x2, go to war with China, don't go to war with China. Let them make all of our stuff. Don't let them make all our stuff. Put me firmly in the category of I don't want to go to war with China and I want to make more of our own stuff. Okay. What really worries me about the China talk in America in 2024 is it's been picked up by the neoconservatives who are just borrowing arguments that many of us have been making for close to a decade. And now they're all real big China hawks, but they want the Chinese to make everything for us. Okay. Well, that's the dumbest of all possible options. I really don't, as the father of 3 young children, I really don't want to go to war with a country that makes all of our antibiotics when I've got 3 little kids at home. So for the neoconservatives, maybe pump the brakes for at least the next 10 years, right? But this is where we're headed, ladies and gentlemen, if we don't recognize that the most important component of foreign power for the middle class in this country starts right here at home. And if we have that industrial might, it's going to make our enemies less likely to start conflicts. If we have that industrial might, our enemies can do less damage to us if they do start those conflicts. And if we have that industrial might, our own country is going to be a lot healthier and happier, completely aside from what we do in the area of foreign policy. So, again, not a fulsome take on everything that I think about foreign policy, but I think hopefully illustrative of how I'm thinking about some of these issues and how I'd encourage some of you to think about these issues too. One, you can't entirely divorce the moral dimension from foreign policy, but the morality we should be pursuing, if we pursue any at all, should be the morality of our own people. And 2, the most important component of projecting power overseas is actually having a strong domestic manufacturing economy here at home. And let me just finish with one observation about how totally broken the Washington consensus is on this, and how their views on Ukraine and Israel are actually totally incompatible. I met with a representative of the Israeli government yesterday, and I don't like to reveal confidences, but one of the things that was said explicitly that I've seen hinted at in news reports and elsewhere is that in January of 2023, when the Biden administration forced the Israelis to empty their munition stockpile and send it all to Ukraine, that actually, you can make a pretty good argument, prolonged the war in Gaza in service of prolonging the war in Ukraine. So if there's a final argument here, it's that we have to accept that there are trade-offs. America cannot manufacture enough weapons to support 4 different wars in 4 different corners of the world. We just can't do it. We can't do it in part because of the decisions made by my bipartisan colleagues of the last 40 years, but it's the reality that we live in, which means that we have to pick and choose. We have to identify where our interests are most important, and we have to try to divert American foreign power to focus on those particular things. And this is why I think it is so important that for the next 30 or 40 years in a world of multipolarity, look, China wasn't built in a decade. It's not going to be unbuilt in a decade. Even if we wanted it to, we have to recognize that Chinese industrial power is here to stay. Okay. So what are we going to do in that world? I think, again, that world of multipolarity, that means that we want the Israelis and the Sunnis to police their own region of the world. We want the Europeans to police their own region of the world. And we want to be able to focus more on East Asia. You can't do that if you're not willing to make trade-offs. And every single day in this town, I see the weird ways in which this current leadership is totally unable to make trade-offs. When I made this argument probably 6 or so months ago among my Senate Republican colleagues, that there were, for example, only so many artillery shells in the world, and we couldn't send them to Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine at the quantities that they want because there aren't enough to send there. So we're going to have to pick and choose. I was told that my math just simply didn't make sense. And yet yesterday, I had a representative of the Israeli government telling me exactly, well, your math did make sense. And in fact, the failure to do those trade-offs prolonged the war in Gaza in a way that I think is really destructive to American interests. So if we want to do a foreign policy, we want to have a foreign policy for the middle class, maybe the most important thing is to recognize what every middle class family in this country recognizes, that we have scarce resources, you have to make trade-offs, and you have to focus on the things that really matter. With that, thank you guys. God bless you.